Welcome to this deep dive from the All Sorts podcast. We've put this together especially for you, the learner, someone who loves connecting those surprising dots and, getting clear insights without feeling bogged down.
Think of knowledge like this huge ocean.
Yeah, and we're diving in to bring back the really cool stuff.
Exactly.
And speaking of diving deep, have you explored everything the All Sorts podcast offers? Over on YouTube, you can like, share, subscribe. Really immerse yourself visually, too.
It adds another dimension, definitely. And don't forget the back catalog right here on your podcast platform. Loads of deep dives already there.
True. And for the conversation between the dives, find us on X, Instagram, Threads. Your thoughts really add to it all.
They really do.
Okay, so today, we're heading into, maybe an unexpected area. The subtle world of implicit bias and how it might, just might, connect with something as major as bankruptcy outcomes.
It's a fascinating potential link. And to explore it, we're leaning on a few key sources. First up, there's an article from the British Psychological Society. It really digs into the ongoing arguments around the implicit association test, the IAT.
Right, the IAT. And we've also got a review that kind of gets under the hood, looking at why the IAT might not be so great at predicting actual behavior.
Exactly that. Plus, there's a pretty detailed research paper suggesting a better way, statistically speaking, to score the IAT results.
Okay.
And finally,
a clear rundown from BitBrain on just how the IAT works and, what the results are supposed to mean.
Got it. So our mission today, break down these sources, help you really grasp what implicit bias is, how this IAT tool tries to measure it, what scientists currently think about its validity, its power.
Its strengths and weaknesses.
Yeah, exactly. And then start thinking about this potential link to financial problems like bankruptcy. Should be some interesting moments here. Okay, let's get into it.
Let's do it. Implicit bias. So it's a term we hear a lot. But fundamentally, what are we talking about? And where does this IAT thing fit in?
Okay, so the implicit association test, or IAT, it's basically a psychological tool. It uses reaction times, how fast people pair words and images to try and measure unconscious associations.
Associations about different social groups.
Right. Things like race, gender, age, that sort of thing. The original thinking was that it could uncover biases people aren't even aware of.
Biases below the surface.
Yeah, and maybe even predict discriminatory actions. And because of that promise, it got picked up widely, diversity training, educational programs.
It sounds revolutionary on the face of it. But that BPS article suggests there are now some pretty big questions hanging over it. What are the main sticking points?
Well, several key doubts have come up. A really central one is, what does the IAT actually measure? Is it really tapping into some deep hidden bias? Or is it more about how familiar we are with cultural stereotypes that are just out there?
Okay, so bias versus stereotype awareness.
Exactly. And then there's debate about the algorithms, the math used to get the scores. And crucially, given how it's been used, the big question, do these IAT scores actually predict how people behave in the real world?
And on that specific point, predicting real-world behavior, it sounds like there's actually quite a bit of agreement now about its limits.
Yes, surprisingly so. Even the people who originally developed the IAT, Greenwald, Raji, Nosek, they put out a statement back in 2015.
Oh, yeah. What did it say?
They acknowledged what they called psychometric issues, basically problems with how reliable and valid the test is. They said these issues make it problematic for classifying individuals, for saying this person is likely to discriminate.
So the creators themselves are saying be careful using it to label people.
Pretty much. And now, most researchers, both proponents and critics, tend to agree the test is just too noisy, too unreliable to predict if a specific person will act discriminatorily day to day.
And there's data backing that up.
Yeah, meta-analyses studies that combine results from many other studies show pretty weak links between IAT scores and behavior. And those links are mostly found in lab settings, not necessarily out in the wild. In fact, one big meta-analysis, Nosek was even a co-author, found that for race bias, the IAT accounts for only about 1% of the variation in actual measured behavior.
Wow, just 1%. That really... Yeah. That puts it in perspective.
It does. It highlights the limitations if you're thinking of it as a direct predictor of individual actions.
So if it's not great at predicting individual behavior, what's the current take? Is it still useful at all? Or is it basically obsolete?
Well, it's not quite that simple. According to some, John Just, who's a big name in IAT research, he kind of suggests the diagnostic IAT, the version used to sort of label individuals, that version is effectively dead.
Okay.
But he argues a different approach, maybe one that's more sensitive to context, could still have value. for research, maybe for education, as long as you're not using it to judge individuals.
But that BPS article implies this might be, kind of rewriting the history a bit, downplaying how strongly it was initially promoted.
That's definitely a point of contention raised in the article. It argues that the initial claims were much stronger. They pointed to things like Banaji and Greenwald's book Blind Spot, and even an email from Greenwald that suggested the IAT could signal or predict discriminatory behavior, help identify people less likely to discriminate.
Ah, so the story changed.
The criticism is that the narrative seems to have shifted. Initially, it was presented more like it measured something stable inside a person, not something fluid that changes a lot depending on the situation.
Right.
The article uses this analogy, a moat and Bailey. You make a big, bold claim, the Bailey, and when it's attacked, you retreat to a smaller, safer, more defensible position, the moat.
I see. So making strong claims about prediction, then falling back to, well, it's educational when challenged on the prediction part.
That's the criticism being described, yeah. It boils down to this fundamental question. Is the IAT measuring a real unconscious preference, like a hidden dislike? Or is it just picking up that we know the stereotypes exist in our culture?
And that distinction seems crucial.
Absolutely, because if it claims to measure hidden bias but actually measures stereotype awareness or maybe a mix, that changes everything about how we interpret the results and use the test.
Okay, so we know the IAT has issues predicting behavior.
Yeah.
That 2019 review by Meisner and colleagues, it really tries to figure out why. What were the main problems they flagged?
Yeah, they pinpointed 4 key issues. The first they called extraneous influences on implicit measures.
Extraneous influences, meaning?
Meaning factors other than your actual attitude are messing with the score. One big one they talk about is recoding.
Recoding. Can you unpack that a bit?
Sure. It's like your brain automatically groups things together, maybe based on how familiar they are or how positive or negative they feel. In the IAT, this happens more easily in the compatible tasks, the ones where the pairings feel more natural or expected.
Okay.
But it's harder in the incompatible tasks. This difference in how easily your brain recodes can affect your reaction times and thus your IAT score, but it might have nothing to do with actual bias.
Ah, I get it. It's like sorting things into mental boxes automatically, and that sorting speed gets mixed into the bias score.
Exactly. So the final score isn't pure bias. It's a mix of associations and these other cognitive processes, like how easily you categorize things.
That makes a lot of sense. It contaminates the result, you could say. What was the second weakness?
The second one was the focus on associations versus beliefs. The IAT measures how strongly things are linked in your mind, like me and good.
Right.
But it doesn't tell you why they're linked. It lacks that deeper relational information you get with beliefs. Does associating I and good mean you believe you're good, or you wish you were good, or something else entirely?
So it shows the connection, but not the why or the how.
Precisely. And that ambiguity makes it really hard to predict specific actions based just on those associations.
Okay. So extraneous influences, ambiguous associations. What was number 3?
Number 3 was about inadequate measurement of the criterion being the actual behavior you're trying to predict.
Right, the real-world actions.
The review points out that lots of studies use self-reports asking people what they would do, but we know that's often not reliable, especially for sensitive stuff like bias, what people say versus what they do.
Could be very different.
Very different. Plus, real behavior is super context dependent. How you act in one situation might be totally different in another. But the IAT usually measures associations in this very general, context-free way.
Yeah, that seems like a huge disconnect, a lab test versus the messy reality of life. Okay, and the fourth point.
The fourth point was really tied into the third, reinforcing those issues with self-report and the lack of context. The core suggestion from the review was that researchers need to get better at measuring actual behavior in specific contexts.
Not just relying on questionnaires.
Right, and maybe even developing implicit measures that are themselves more context-specific. They also floated the idea of focusing more on wanting rather than just liking, like using a wanting IAT to potentially bridge that gap between implicit measures and actual motivation or behavior.
Okay, so that review really lays out why predicting behavior from IAT scores is so tricky. It's the test itself being influenced by other things, the fuzziness of associations, and the sheer difficulty of capturing real behavior.
Exactly. It underlines why we need to be cautious about seeing an IAT score as a direct map onto someone's future actions.
Got it. Now, despite all these critiques, researchers haven't just abandoned the IAT. That 2003 paper by Greenwald, Nosek, and Banerjee, the original developers, they were trying to improve it, specifically the scoring. What was their goal there?
Well, they saw the limitations in the standard way of calculating the scores. They wanted to create a better algorithm, one that would give a more accurate, more reliable measure of those implicit associations.
And how did they decide what better meant? What were they measuring the new scoring methods against?
They set up several key benchmarks. First, how well did the new scores match up with people's explicit, self-reported attitudes? They wanted a stronger connection there.
Okay, closer alignment with conscious beliefs.
Second, how much was the score affected by just general response speed? Some people are just faster responders overall, and they didn't want that to skew the bias measure.
Right, isolate the bias effect from just speed.
Third, internal consistency. Does the measure give similar results across different parts of the test? Fourth, sensitivity. Does it pick up known biases, like the common? Basically, it looks at the difference in average reaction times between the crucial test blocks, the compatible versus incompatible ones, and then it divides that difference by a measure of the person's overall response time variability during those blocks. It kind of calibrates the different score based on how consistent that person's responses are overall.
So it accounts for individual differences in response speed consistency.
Exactly. And their second study showed this D measure had the best correlation with explicit attitudes and was least contaminated by just raw response speed differences between people. They use these things called LOC curves, latency operating characteristics, to show it visually.
And they also looked into things like tossing out really fast responders or how to handle mistakes people make during the test.
They did. Study 3 found that removing people with a lot of super fast responses under 300 milliseconds did slightly boost that connection between the IAT score and explicit attitudes, especially for the D measure. Then, study 4 looked at errors. And kind of surprisingly, they found that including the reaction times from error trials actually gave better results, stronger correlations with explicit measures than just throwing those trials out.
Really? Including the mistakes helped?
Yeah, they tried different ways to penalize errors, but just using the raw error latency worked best. The thinking might be that errors often happen when the association is weak or conflicts, so the time it takes to make that error still contains useful information.
Huh. That's counterintuitive, but interesting. What about really slow responses or outliers?
That was study 5. They found that deleting or adjusting extreme latencies, whether very fast or very slow, didn't make a huge difference to the correlation with explicit measures. Sometimes it even increased the contamination from overall response speed.
So fiddling with outliers wasn't necessarily better.
Not significantly, though they noted that removing responses faster than maybe 350 or 400 milliseconds seemed okay, offering a slight improvement without messing up the speed contamination issue.
Okay, so after all these different studies and comparisons, what was the big takeaway, the main recommendation?
Their final big comparison, study 6, put different versions of the D measure up against the older conventional scoring methods across all 7 of their performance criteria.
And the D measure won out.
Pretty consistently, yes. The D-based scores generally performed better, especially on that crucial correlation with explicit attitudes and resistance to speed contamination. They singled out one version, D2, which involved removing responses under 400 meters and using the built-in error penalty as having good all-around performance.
So the conclusion was?
The strong recommendation was to ditch the old scoring method and adopt this improved D measure because it simply performed better on multiple important indicators of validity.
Okay, that makes sense. Improve the tool if you can. So we've covered a lot what implicit bias is supposed to be, the IAT tool, its controversies and limitations, and the efforts to refine the scoring. Now, let's pivot to this really intriguing, maybe speculative part, the potential link to bankruptcy outcomes. Our sources don't draw a direct line, right?
No, absolutely not. This is where we need to be careful and think hypothetically, based on the understanding we've built. The sources give us the foundation on bias and measurement, but not this specific connection.
So how might these subtle biases play a role, even indirectly, in something as severe as bankruptcy?
Well, you can hypothesize ways implicit biases around race, gender, age, whatever, could feed into discriminatory practices within financial systems. Think about loan applications, getting hired or promoted, finding housing, even the kind of advice you get from a financial planner.
So the bias isn't necessarily conscious malice, but it could still create disadvantages.
Exactly. If individuals making decisions or even the algorithms used by institutions carry these implicit biases, it could lead to certain groups systematically getting, say, worse loan terms, fewer job opportunities, or facing more barriers to building wealth.
And those disadvantages could accumulate over time.
Precisely. These could create systemic disadvantages that make certain groups more financially fragile, more vulnerable to economic shocks, and potentially increase their overall risk of ending up in bankruptcy down the line.
It's a sobering idea that these unconscious patterns we've been talking about, measured imperfectly by tools like the IAT, could contribute to such huge real-world disparities.
It is, and again, it's crucial to stress this isn't proven by the sources we looked at today. Bankruptcy is incredibly complex.
Right. Many factors involved.
So many factors: the economy, predatory lending practices, unexpected medical bills, job loss, individual choices. It's a whole web.
So we're not saying implicit bias causes bankruptcy in a direct A to B way.
Definitely not.
It's more about asking, could these subtle pervasive biases be one contributing thread in the larger tapestry of factors that lead to unequal financial outcomes, including, potentially, bankruptcy rates?
That's a much better way to frame it. It's raising the question, do these biases, however difficult to measure perfectly, contribute to wider societal inequalities that then manifest in things like disparate financial health? It points towards needing more research to specifically investigate that potential link.
Fascinating and definitely complex. Thank you for navigating us through all of that, the details of the IAT, the debates, the attempts at improvement, and this potential connection to financial vulnerability. For you, the learner, we really hope this deep dive has given you some solid insights and maybe sparked some new questions.
Yeah, the whole field of social cognition, how we think about others, it's constantly changing. Understanding these nuances feels pretty important for making sense of the world.
Absolutely. Now, before you go, let these ideas settle, maybe inspire some action. If the All Sorts podcast shed some light for you today, think about sharing that light. Like, share, subscribe over on YouTube. Seeing things visually can really add to it.
Definitely check out the YouTube channel. And remember the archive here on your podcast app. Tons more deep dives waiting.
And please, keep the conversation going. Follow us on X, Instagram, Threads. We love hearing your perspectives. It makes the whole exploration richer. Your engagement genuinely helps us reach more people with these kinds of discussions.
It really does.
So we'll leave you with a final thought to chew on. If these unconscious biases are potentially more widespread and influential than we tend to think, what are the subtle, maybe even invisible ways they could be shaping our world? Not just our one-on-one interactions, but bigger systems, bigger outcomes.
It's definitely something worth pondering as you continue your own journey of learning and discovery.
Until our next deep dive, keep exploring and keep questioning.